I think that this is the right answer.
So good afternoon, and thank you all for coming back in. This is a difficult session, let's make no mistakes about it. I expect we're only in February, but already I think we know what is the phrase of the year: double standards. And the application of international humanitarian law is at the core of that despair that I think many of us feel about double standards, the application of different standards in different situations. And I want to begin by us all reminding ourselves that this isn't just Ukraine and Russia, it isn't just the Middle East, but that we're all largely oblivious to the crises in Sudan, in Tigray, and elsewhere, where actually even more lives have been lost. Where I think beyond these terrible acts of where we see a loss of life on a vast scale, we also are reminded today by the tragedy of one brave man who has stood up for human rights and democracy in Russia. This is not the first time that the beginning of a Munich Security Conference has been surprised by a sort of bouquet from President Putin. 2 years ago, it was the eve of the intervention in Ukraine. Today, tragically, it's the news of the death of Navalny. And so these issues of impunity and double standards, I think, are at the heart of how we build back the legitimacy of an international order, which is seen as fair and just and even-handed. And I can't imagine a better panel to help us on that. Mirjana, immediately to my right, is now the president of the ICRC, which is right there trying to preserve its neutrality and weave its way through these extraordinarily complex and political disputes. Beside her is Prime Minister de Croo of Belgium, who, as we'll hear later, was in Rafah a few months ago. Tzipi Livni, an old friend who was foreign minister of Israel at the time of 2006 and the Lebanon intervention, and I was at the time the UN Deputy Secretary General. Since she's been leader of the opposition, and I think you'll find has fascinating views on all of this, a common Israeli position, but also a shared sense of humanity, and I suspect, if she's willing to say it in Munich, a frustration with the current Prime Minister and his approach, but we'll leave it to say so. And Udo, who is an old OSF colleague of mine, but is now running the Center for Civilians in Conflict. And Udo, I'm going to start with you, because you just yesterday published in Al Jazeera an article which, close to my own heart, said these double standards are everywhere. It doesn't just stop with the Middle East or Ukraine. And just give us a sense of the context of that, what you meant by that in terms of how the world is today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. And I must thank the Munich Security Conference for giving this conversation this kind of platform. I think it's a powerful message about where we are in the world today and how it is important for us to talk about the protection of international humanitarian law. And I approach this conversation as a father, not just because of my role. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I've been haunted for days by the video recording of Hind Rajab asking for somebody to come get her because she was cold, because it was dark, because she was inside the vehicle. And somehow, she died. What does international humanitarian law mean to her? What does it mean to baby Bibas and Ariel, the 4-year-old boy in Israel who was taken by Hamas? What does international humanitarian law mean to these little kids? My colleague Dina is from Sudan. Her uncle, Mohammed El Raya, and Ahmed, we are packing up their car to run away when the war started in Sudan, a bomb landed in their courtyard, killed both of them, and killed their auntie. What does international humanitarian law mean for these people? What does it mean for my colleagues in Ukraine? Alex, Segi, every day they wonder if they're going to make it home. And international humanitarian law is only as good as its implementation. It's a wonderful set of rules, but the implementation gives meaning to it. And I start this conversation this way because I don't want us to feel like we're going into a legal argument or we're going into an academic exercise. We're talking about people's lives. And funny enough, the way the world is going, every one of us in this room could today be a civilian in conflict, in a conflict area. And we need to have a system that protects all of us. And so to that, I have 4 points to make on this conversation. One, the moment, or rather the behavior of political expediency trumping the principles and the sacred nature of international humanitarian law undermines that system completely. If we are going to have a system that works, we need to apply these rules for everybody. Same standard for everybody. The color of skin, nationality, or affiliation should never be a determinant of how the world responds when these rules are breached. The man holding the gun or the woman holding the gun, the color of their skin should not excuse their action. It has to be the same rule for everybody. It has to be the same enforcement for everybody. If we elevate these principles of both politics, perhaps it will have meaning. But if we keep this behavior of a la carte application, what works for me when it works for me, then we are creating a system that can endanger all of us. The second point is that claim to global leadership should be dependent on modeling good behavior and protecting the system of international law. Countries across the world, everybody wants to be seen as the good guy. Every country wants to be the powerful country. Let that power draw from your modeling of good behavior, ensuring that you are protecting the system. And to this point, I speak directly to the members of the Security Council. As much as every country has a role in protecting international humanitarian law, members of the Security Council have even a higher role of protecting that system. They have not played that role in good faith. Be it in the aggression in Ukraine, be it the equivocation in Gaza, be it the lackluster approach in Sudan, or the amnesia in Somalia. They have not shown themselves to be good faith protectors of the system. And if they don't protect the system hollows out. So to whom more is given, more is expected. Finally, the notion that international humanitarian law is a Western construct doesn't hold. It is a set of principles for which all countries signed up to. Is also one thing we can all agree on: protecting the dignity of the human person, protecting civilians in conflict situation. And so Africa, Middle East, and I speak of Africa, they need to shape up and do a bit more in ensuring that these principles are protected, that civilians are protected. There is no night in Cape that is going to come to solve this problem for us in Africa. We need to do it ourselves. And this means we need to support the system of accountability, the International Criminal Court. This also means that the world together need to rethink the historical injustice and colonialism that has influenced this structure of international criminal justice, and make sure that it's inclusive, that there's a balance, and that every part of the world is represented and respected in that system. So it becomes a credible platform that is not just credible, but also acceptable and effective. I'll stop here for now.
Thanks, Udo, very much. And you framed it just as I hoped you would, as a wide issue. But let's hone in for a moment on the Middle East. And Prime Minister, you were in Rafah a few months ago. You called for respect for the ICJ judgment. You know, we are at a time when nearly 30,000 lives have been lost in Gaza, even though it follows on the heels of an absolutely appalling and grim Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th. When is enough enough, and how do we stop this sort of apparently indiscriminate killing of civilians? And I think it is worth saying, just to build on Udo's point, the last 2 years have been the most violent in terms of civilian deaths since the Rwanda genocide. I mean, we're living at a moment when the sort of rules of law as regards civilians seem to be breaking down everywhere, not just the Middle East, but much more widely. Prime Minister.
Indeed, as you say, not just in the Middle East. I think what differentiates us as liberal democracies from tyrannies and dictatorships is that we do respect a set of fundamental rules. We do respect democracy, we do respect the rule of law, and we do respect international humanitarian law. And I think if we start not doing it, then we lose our moral voice. And what I said in Rafah was that Israel has a right to defend its population against a terrorist threat, and has a right to have security guarantees. But we're now 30,000 civilians deaths down the road, unfortunately, and it needs to stop. And I was in Rafah 3 months ago. At that point, I said, can we liberate the hostages and have a ceasefire? I think today, the only thing you can say is have a ceasefire right now and liberate the hostages and get around the table and work on a two-state solution. And a two-state solution is the only answer to the legitimate requests on both sides, which is the inhabitants of Palestine, a perspective on freedom and a perspective in life, but also the pertinent request from the Israeli population to have enough security guarantees in their lives. I mean, both requests are legitimate requests. That can only stop if the feeding ground for terrorism is stopped, and there's multi-dimensions to that. But there's not only a military solution to that, a civilian solution to that is necessary as well, which means a leadership in Palestine that is a real partner in building peace. And I think that today, as an outsider, this notion that there would be double standards is a very dangerous one. And we've always been very clear. Human rights, there's no cultural relativity to human rights. And at decisive moments, I think what you can expect from liberal democracies is that they take the necessary step to give the good example. If at a moment as this we cannot give the good example, then why would we think that we still have a voice to listen to?
Yeah, thank you. Tzipi, I think we all want to see a diplomatic engagement. We want to see progress towards a two-state solution. Many of us regret that it sort of wasn't more actively pursued during, the last couple of decades, frankly. But at the same time, I mean, you've come here, from Israel. I mean, your community, your population, your citizens, are, I think, deeply traumatized by this. And on the other side, Palestinians are also traumatized by what's happened to them. And so, I know you will want to speak to the Hamas issue, but it'd be great if you could also share with us how on earth we build back a dialogue, not between international diplomats, who obviously we all want to see an engagement, but amongst these two nations or communities. I mean, how on earth do we get it back to a place where there are peacemakers on both sides?
as you said, I am frustrated. I'm frustrated because the situation, the realities, were that Hamas terrorists infiltrated, entered into people's home, massacred, killed, raped, cut organs, made crimes against humanity, kidnapped, and we still have hostages in captivity, while on the other side, and you have a democracy that is acting in accordance to the international law. The situation is very complicated. On one hand, you have a terrorist organization that part of its charter is genocide against Jews and Israelis, but Israel is the one that is being blamed for genocide in the ICJ. And there is one thing, and I didn't come here, to show frustration or to ask the international community not to, or to turn a blind eye to what we are doing in Gaza, because I believe that Israel, as a democracy, should act in accordance, and this is what we are doing, and I can tell you this as a minister who was also in the security cabinet during the last 2 rounds of military operation in Gaza. But since we've been asked also how to imply the international humanitarian law on non-governmental groups and how to have more respect to the ICC, at first there is one answer that connects the two. Prosecute these terrorists in the ICC. They made crimes against humanity. They filmed it. You can see it. You don't need to enter into the tunnels that they built in Gaza. They are sitting in Qatar or elsewhere. They are saying that if we stop, they will continue in doing the next massacre. So let punish them for what they are doing. And if you want to have more respect or trust in the ICC, right now, or yesterday, the families of the hostages went to Hague, asking the prosecutor to make the decision. And I think that this is something that needs to be done, because otherwise these terrorist organizations are exploiting the humanitarian law for their use. Because when we call the civil population in Gaza to leave their homes before we target, Hamas tells them to stay, because they are his human shields. And there is one thing that, since for better life for Israelis and Palestinians, there is no hope for peace with Hamas. Hamas doesn't represent any legitimate call for a Palestinian state. They are against the mere existence of the state of Israel. They represent this jihadist religious ideology. And I would not agree with this sentence saying that one side freedom fighter is the other side terrorist. I mean, Israel left Gaza Strip. We dismantled all the settlements. On October 6th, there was no one settler, one Israeli soldier in Gaza Strip. We withdrew to the 67 line. And Hamas took over. And the entire international community, the United Nations and Europe and the United States and Russia at the time, said that Gaza can be free if they would just renounce violence and terrorism and accept the right of Israel to exist and accept former peace treaties. So listening here about collective punishment, no, it's not. We are trying to act against terror because there is no hope for peace to the Palestinians as well, as Hamas continues to be an armed militia and a regime. Another thing, don't make this equivalence between a democratic country and terrorist organization, as there is no legal system in the world that put as the same moral standards or even punishment between somebody who killed somebody by mistake or somebody who murdered somebody, not to say torture him before. When you make this equivalence, Hamas is abusing it. They say, okay, we will use these civilians as human shield, because at the end of the day, and this is what is happening, the world will criticize Israel, not us. I mean, you can see the end of this if Hamas releases the prisoners. the hostages, if he stops using all the money that he gets from the international community for their infrastructure of terror instead of giving it to the people. And therefore, for those of us here that truly care about security, about the life of civilians of both sides, for those of us here who would like to see prospects for peace in the Middle East, Hamas is not the answer, it's part of the problem. And by accepting, by putting, yes, I heard today the Secretary General saying, yes, it was horrible what's happened, or you cannot excuse or give an excuse to what happened in this terror attack, but the collective punishment. I mean, it's not collective punishment what we are doing. And therefore, last thing, to speak about legitimacy of this terrorist organization. I hear these voices of they were elected, or the other stuff that this is also heard from Griffith, I think, that, well, they have a terror arm and political arm. It's the same body, it's the same vicious mind. You cannot legitimize these kind of horrors by saying that they have a political branch. These political leaders are now discussing how to get more terrorists from Israeli jail by releasing the hostages that they kidnapped, or their other arm kidnapped from their homes. And I asked the international community and the United States before the elections in the Palestinian Authority to prevent Hamas from participating in the elections. I mean, before this kind of jihadist group abuse democracy for their own need by threatening their own people, they need to choose between bullets and ballots.
But Tzipi, if I may, just
this can be the beginning of a change after all these horrors, maybe, if we take the right moral stance, according to the international law, but apply them also on these terrorists.
Just a quick one, because then I do want to turn to Mirjana, but I think nobody in this room, I suspect, is guilty of actually thinking there is an equivalency between Hamas and Israel. Israel is a democratic state. You heard the Prime Minister talk about democracies having to live by certain standards. And so I think Israel is making a mistake, or you're making a mistake, to think that our concern about the loss of Palestinian lives is around an equivalency with Hamas. It is around this international humanitarian law point of innocent civilians in very large numbers losing their lives in the prosecution of this military campaign. And I think, all I would just ask you is just a very simple question. Is there any way this can be brought to a close before an intervention in Rafah, which is likely to cost a lot more civilian lives? Is there any way we can move it onto a political track? Because I doubt there is anybody at Munich, or almost anybody, who wouldn't say that the elimination of, or the removal of Hamas from the political picture in Gaza, that is a very reasonable aim, but we're talking about something different here, which is how do we protect the civilians? And is there a way of stopping this sooner rather than later?
I think that while we are sitting in, what the Israeli army is doing is trying to find a way to continue with the need to attack Hamas and to act against their terror infrastructure while avoiding, as far as we can, civil casualties. So, I'm not now familiar with the exact plans, but I think that, I know that this is what they are doing. Yeah. But for those of us also looking for a ceasefire, just a ceasefire, I'm not speaking about the release of hostages and so on. If Hamas remains in power with this terror infrastructure, Israelis and Palestinians will suffer again and again because they will continue enacting terror, and we, without any other alternative, will continue in answering and trying to defend our citizens. And therefore, there is real opportunity here. And I heard also what Vice President Kamala Harris said today about maybe a new regional structure that includes other countries, maybe the Saudis, and hopefully change Hamas regime with another Palestinian regime. We don't want to control them. Yeah. We don't want to reoccupy Gaza. But I hope that somebody in Washington and elsewhere in the region is working about it these days.
Well, thank you.
Can I just really, sure. 30 seconds. When you say that money of the international community is being used by Hamas to build their infrastructure, let me just disagree with that. I disagree with that. We finance UNRWA, and we will continue financing UNRWA, because it's a population that is one of the most poor populations in the world.
I would like to suggest...
And I've heard that criticism time and time over again, and I reject it. We do everything, everything to control that, and this is just about human decency. Our development building in Gaza has been bombed. It's been bombed. We still wonder why it has been bombed. We are only there to help civilians. We're just trying to give kids a decent life. And what we see is that every day 100 kids are dying. 100 every day. Please don't blame us for helping human lives.
Yeah.
I did not blame you for helping human lives. I'm not blaming, but I'm suggesting to be more cautious and to follow your money.
We do. We do.
That's fine.
But
if this is being done, that's fine.
Hold it, because I think
this is... But if not, so everybody's suffering,
okay.
The Palestinians.
This is a very good moment to bring Mirjana in, because you know, I know that actually at an earlier point in your life, and I'm asking you about the ICRC, but you were yourself, you spent a couple of years with UNRWA. And so you had a whole career around this issue of how do you protect the neutrality of humanitarian operations in the midst of exactly these kinds of political disputes where the non-political nature of humanitarianism is challenged. And, you know, I've just watched so many times those Red Cross vehicles going places we UNers weren't allowed to go because you did have the trust of both sides. It must be getting harder and harder.
Thank you, Mark. This is not an easy time for the International Committee of the Red Cross. It is also not an easy time for me as the president of the institution, which is 160 years old and which will hopefully continue for 160 years. But forever, we have been criticized for our neutrality, for our confidentiality, and for not taking sides. Now, it is very natural for parties to a conflict to take sides and to want to protect their citizens and to do their utmost to protect their citizens. And because that is the case, states came together and created the ICRC because they knew that they have to have this neutral intermediary. But what states also did, based on the experience of the Second World War, is created 4 Geneva Conventions. And this is where our mandate is anchored. And I think Udo said it in the beginning, the Geneva Conventions have been ratified by all states. It's a joint responsibility. And armed groups, and we have a dialogue on IHL with 250 armed groups around the globe. We don't qualify them. We engage with everybody who bears weapons and has power and has the power to influence those who bear weapons, to comply with international humanitarian law, because everybody is bound by them, and because everybody who has influence on a party to a conflict is bound to make their utmost to ensure that IHL is implemented. Now, the Geneva Conventions constitute the strongest international consensus. The underpinning principles, and the key principle is preserving humanity at all times to keep that pathway back to peace. To preserve that principle, you have to, reduce harm for civilians. and reduce harm for non-combatants. Now, you can do two things. You can follow the letter of the law. First of all, you can, as a leader or as a party to a conflict, you can decide to completely ignore them. You can say, we don't consider ourselves bound by it. We're just not going to follow the rules because war is not a lawless space. Or you can hollow it out by working around it for as long as you can, saying, I'm complying, I'm doing my utmost, but still we see enormous amounts of casualties. But you would still be following the letter of the law, and we will not be able to contest any of that. Or as a political leader, you can say, we follow not only the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the Geneva Conventions is not only to preserve humanity, but it is to limit, as far as possible, harm on civilians and non-combatants, prisoners of war, hostages. I mean, it's all, taking hostages are violations of international humanitarian law. Mistreating prisoners of war or detainees are violations of the Geneva Conventions. But again, you can be compliant, or you can follow the spirit of the law, which is preserving humanity, and you can go even further in acknowledging that preserving humanity means recognizing that you can't put civilian lives on a human scale, that there is the fundamental principle of equality that applies, and I think you have been speaking about this as well, which says, any civilian life on any side of the conflict deserves the same treatment and protection provided and ensured, implemented by states parties to a conflict and by enabling humanitarian actors like the ICRC to operate. Why did we create the Geneva Conventions? It's because we had this experience of dehumanizing the other and of accepting the fact that victory at all cost is legitimate, but we all know that it means accepting that you accept the extinction of the other at the end of the road, if that is necessary for a victory at all cost. And this is what we stand against. This is what the Geneva Conventions stand against, to prevent that from happening again. In all places of conflict, I'm not speaking about Gaza, because we work in 100 situations of conflict, and war is ugly everywhere. And there are civilian casualties everywhere, and everywhere they have to be limited at its most. Now, it's a political decision what implementation of IHL means to you and how far you're willing to go to implement and ensure implementation and use your influence to ensure implementation of IHL. And where that threshold is of human suffering that you as a human being, not only as a political leader, are willing to accept. And then you have to negotiate, and then you have to find solutions that are workable and actionable, not only to ensure peace and security, because that's the only way to mitigate humanitarian fallouts, but also to ensure that you're not offloading the responsibility for not implementing IHL onto the humanitarian organizations, because we can only do so much as the size of the space that the parties to a conflict and those who can influence them allow us to occupy.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, if we may stop there, because I think it's time to bring in an audience which I'm sure sees the sort of passions and issues which are getting raised here, and who would questions? Sir.
I'm from Bangladesh.
Wait. Hold on, we'll just bring you a microphone.
Especially counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. and I fully support 90% of what the ex-foreign minister of Israel has said. I've forgotten your name, sorry. Or I might pronounce it differently. That's right. In fact, Hamas, what is Hamas or who is Hamas? It's not an individual. It is two aspects. One is Hamas himself, and if you can kill Hamas, I would be most happy because he is a terrorist. But it is also an ideology that is anti-Israel. So we have fought we are predominantly Islamic state, but we are 100% secular. We never tolerate Islamic terrorism. We have fought with Al-Qaeda, we have fought with many others, and still fighting with Ansar al-Islam, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and others. We never give them any space. And I know how you feel about losing the dear ones, like you have lost many in Hamas attack. And I think you have already retaliated and taken lives of about almost 30 times more than what you have lost. So I think only thing you can kill Hamas is by sympathizing the general public of Israel by making Hamas isolated, like take the fish out of the water. He is getting, otherwise you are creating more Hamas. The kid who is running now, who has already lost 3 of his brothers, mother, father, he will be becoming double than Hamas. More vengeance towards, he will come back, maybe after 10 years. So this is not the solution. Otherwise what you said, I congratulate you that you are not for space. You don't want Gaza. And there was a theme, I think, the peace for pace. But the main Hamas, you made Hamas stronger by resettling settlers and other things. So this, if you give them the assurance and give them now, let them access to the humanitarian assistance, which you, ironically, you don't allow much or disturb, I think that will be enough to cause the death of Hamas or the ideology of Hamas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have a few more questions before we come back. Other questions? Everyone daunted by this issue? Any more before we go back to the speakers? Sir.
If the Geneva Convention is not being respected, what are the options? So should we be looking at amendments to the Geneva Convention? Because I understand there is no room for punishment. So if a country doesn't follow after having signed or be a signatory to the Geneva Convention, how do you rectify that? And are there instances of action being taken on countries who haven't delivered and lived up to their obligations?
Thank you. Very good questions. Back there. Well, one immediately behind, and then over there. We'll come to you next, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Gustavo from Colombia. I have a general question, sort of as a matter of reflection. Whenever I hear these conflicting perspectives between the developed world and the developing world, that could also apply to my country, the biggest doubt that comes to my mind in terms of counterterrorism is if this situation, sort of what's going in Colombia, what's happening in Israel, regardless of my personal position, would Europe's position be the same if it were happening inside this country? I feel like many times it's easy to predicate a standard that in practice is very hard to apply. And this relates to, again, what's happening in Israel and Colombia. But I would ask you to just try to think if what's going in Israel or what's going in Colombia right now were happening in Belgium, in France, in Spain, do you actually think that in practice you'd be able to stick to those principles that are so actively defended abroad internationally and are part of the agenda today?
Mm-hmm. Very good questions all. There, yeah.
Thank you. Sana Mandolini from the International Civil Society Action Network and the Robert Bosch Foundation. I'm slightly worried that history is starting on October 7th. History didn't start on October 7th. There has been systematic violations and violence against Palestinians for many years. So the efforts of the last 30 years of trying to get us to a two-state solution are really what led us here, because we didn't look at the populations, whether it's Palestinian or Israeli. We didn't really look at how the people should live together. I'm just curious, at some point this violence is going to have to stop. People are going to have to live together. And if we go back down the path of bringing small groups of politicians together with the American interlocutors or whoever they are, it's not going to end. What we need is a people's peace process and two parallel processes in Palestine and in Israel to come to terms with what's happened, to mourn, to have the psychological, emotional, and the vision of the future that they want. And I'm just wondering, what's the appetite for that? And is there a willingness to work with peace-building organizations and those of us who are thinking about these things holistically? Because the last 30 years gave us where we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. One last one, Nicola Reindorp in there.
That working, yeah. Nicola Reindorp, Crisis Action. I started my work in the wake of the Rwandan genocide and have spent 25 years campaigning for the prevention of atrocities. And every minister, every government minister I've ever met believes fundamentally that every life is equal. Every diplomat I've ever met has always said we uphold the Geneva Conventions, the importance of those rules. We know in our hearts, as Udo said, our children, we want for our own children what we want for others' children. And yet that challenge, or we doubt, if it was on our doorstep, would the same decisions be made? Do we uphold these rules? So I guess the question, particularly to the politicians on the panel, what is it that we can do to make it politically easier? We know for our peace deals that it requires forgiveness, acceptance of the other's point of view. We know that's how peacemaking happens. So what do we do to make it easier for the politicians to show the political courage to recognise, not, as Prince Zaid, who's also here, that we tribalise our pain and focus on our own hurt, but actually to recognise these rules that are the mark of our equality, that are at the heart of our security, not the optional extra for us to regard when it suits us.
Okay, well, look, I think we've got various questions there, some of which drive at this point that a conflict of this kind is driving people apart. So even if diplomats try to come together, people are being driven apart. And how do we rebuild trust and peace from the bottom up? The second is around the issue of the standards, politicians having the bravery to find ways to end this, to respect the equality of human life. And within that, the first question from the Bangladesh National Security Advisor around the whole issue that you can kill the men, but you may, in so doing, feed the ideology and give it and actually multiply it. And of course, double standards are not necessarily just around these conflicts. As we heard, what would we do if we had something like this in Europe? I could provocatively say we do in Ukraine and we condemn it, but that's not what you meant, and I understand that if this was in the heart of Europe. So a rich set of questions, and of course, let's start, though, with the Geneva one, and we do need to all be very quick. We've got a minute each. What do you do about the enforcement of the conventions?
Look, as the ICRC, we don't enforce. We don't have the power to enforce. The obligation to abide by the Geneva Conventions lies with the states and the parties to conflict. Now, it starts in peacetime. You start by integrating these rules into your national legislation, training your armed forces, training everyone who is in the security system to know the rules, because that's already the first step. And then you influence your friends to also comply with international humanitarian law. What we want is to preserve the path back to peace. What we do not want is to accept a principle where war is fought against all rules and, when no rules apply, because that would only lead to the next war to become more violent, bigger, and with bigger ripple effects. And what we observe today is that the ripple effects spread faster and have a far greater impact due to the globalization and due to our interconnectivity. So the compliance has to become a political priority for each and every leader, and how you then do it is something we can support you in by giving you our expertise. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Yeah, so first on the Colombian question, if I can ask it that way. Look, we Belgium, we are a moderately small country in the middle of big countries. We've been invaded, our whole history, we've been invaded by all our neighbors. If there is one country that knows what the value is of international humanitarian law, I think we are one of them. And that's because of our history. Now, fortunately, we've lived 3 generations in Europe without war. The whole endeavor is how do we live a 4th and a 5th generation without war? And we will need a lot of unity between European countries and also within NATO to preserve that. Now, what would you do if something would happen? It's hard for me to imagine what happened in Israel because of the scale, because of the atrocity. So it's hard to put myself in that situation. Unfortunately, we've had terrorist attacks on a smaller scale, but we've had them, and we did apply the rule of law. And at some point, we had to organize the court system for that, and the defense said that the persons that were being judged were not being treated in the right way, and we did adapt. And a large part of the public said, why are you doing that? Why are you spending all that money? They killed people, and they did. I mean, the judge decided on that. But we did everything to respect the rule of law. And that brings me to the second question on what can you do to make it easier on us. That's what you said. Look, there's books, I would say libraries written on capacity building and education and a lot of lingo, if I can call it that way. In the end, it comes back to political will. And in the end, it's about personal leadership. Is this about politics or is it about humanity? And to me, politics and humanity is not opposed one against the other. And I think, as I said, that's what differentiates us. Liberal democracies who do respect the rule of law with autocracies. And you have to prove that every day. And I think this is one of the ways of proving it.
Tzipi, we're into overtime, so as briefly as you can be, and then Udo.
Firstly, I agree that it's a matter of leadership, because those speaking about this ideology, and Hamas is not just an organization, but also an idea. Nazism was an idea. So the question is, what is the way you really educate your children, and what is the message that leadership is giving its people? But I want to say something also about Gaza. I mean, we left Gaza. I supported a disengagement plan. I evacuated Israelis who were born there. We decided to give them hope for peace. But Hamas doesn't represent, we have a national conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Hamas doesn't represent this kind of solvable conflict. It represents just hatred. And therefore, I hope to see, since we tried everything, we left Gaza, we had some military operation that ended with hoped deterrence, but it didn't work, agreements with, it didn't work. So the only way to give hope for the future is not only to eradicate Hamas as a terrorist organization, but to replace them as a regime, as a government, with another Palestinian regime, because we don't want it to be there, and Palestinians deserve a Palestinian regime that does not support terror, that does not educate for hatred, and realities are bad enough, so it's not just about education, but it's part of it. And saying something about convention, this is what I tried to say at the beginning. I mean, we are democracies, and we want to be part of the free world because we share the same set of values. Therefore, we also agreed and joined the conventions, and now we are dealing how to force countries to do this and that while these terrorists for them it doesn't exist, this international law, and therefore its most important thing is to work together. And as I said before, I believe that it's important, but it is so complicated. As a minister who sat in the cabinet, and I can assure you that on each and every target we got an approval from the Attorney General. And it is a very complicated situation, so I'm not saying, okay, so let's change the law or we can do whatever, not at all. But I wish you can understand better the complexity of the situation. And just one last, before I left the parliament, I was the chairman of legal affairs and the connection also between the army and the law. And I asked, because there are those also in Israel saying that the international humanitarian law makes it more difficult to fight terror, and as you know, there were those that wanted to change the judicial institutions in Israel. And the answer that I got from the army commander when I asked him whether he feels that the international law makes it more difficult for him, the answer was, but without it, it is our own values. And I wish you would believe that this is the way the Israeli army is acting when there's a need to eradicate terror.
Thank you, Tzipi. Literally, Udo, and I'm really sorry, but a sentence.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I think my final word is that protecting this system is an enlightened self-interest. Yeah. Because nobody is immune from the danger of a global anarchy. Yeah. And that is where we go to if we continue this way. And at the end of the day, who suffers for it? Most of the conflict, 90% of casualties are civilians. Yeah. And that should worry all of us, because we could be one of those someday.
Look, I think, thank you, and I think what we can all conclude from this is that peace and security in the Middle East, but many other places too, is going to be a long and arduous path. But by not applying international humanitarian law, it's harder and more arduous. It is critical, I think. And so, look, this has been a very rich and respectful discussion about very difficult issues that are. The organizers want me to remind you of several other sessions on the Middle East, which will come later. But for now, thank you to every panelist who's joined us today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.